The Bell Curve is a 1994 book funded by the Bradley Foundation and heavily reliant on research supported by the Pioneer Fund, including multiple scholars with ties to Mankind Quarterly. In lay terms, Murray and Herrnstein use, without real disclosure, sources with ties to the Candor League of Rhodesia, the Defense and Brown v. Board of Education, multiple proponents of apartheid South Africa, various contemporaneous Nazi sympathizers, fascist Italy's eugenics movement, scientists who published under Hitler's regime in Germany, and, a personal favorite, Ottmar von Verscher, a leading race scientist in Nazi Germany and an academic mentor of Josef Mengele, in an effort to establish a naturalist rationale for the unquestioned hegemony of the capitalist class. However, employing a coterie of people who give butterfly kisses to the line between scumbag and genocide heir doesn't make the bell curve wrong, just as Richard Lynn's clear desire to prove once and for all that all black people are retarded doesn't make his research wrong. What makes it wrong isn't even the terrible methodological flaws in many of its sources or the amateurish statistical methods, although these are the most obvious reasons. If you want to dig into these, I recommend this article by Charles Lane or this rebuttal by Fisher et al., respectively. The bell curve fails on the level of epistemology. In other words, this book is what Rational Wiki refers to as not even wrong, in that its investigation could never have drawn conclusions about the things it sought to investigate because its authors either ostensibly or really didn't understand them. So, what's the deal with this book then? One way of viewing the bell curve is to take it at face value as a product of the compassionate conservative era of neocon think-tankery. Another is to see it as something pushing racial and ethnic hierarchical naturalism as a means of protecting the wealth of capitalists who are not willing or not able to produce a functional economy, which would be closer to naked fascist propaganda. Even so, I doubt the bell curve really made anyone believe in these things who didn't already, in the same way that I doubt anyone ever became instantly homophobic after reading Leviticus. This book is just a tool, a smokescreen, a fetish, and it's doubtful that many of the people who purport to have gotten their ideas on race and intelligence from it have ever read it. This is the central thesis of this essay. Murray and Herrnstein construct a number of ideological totems that allow them to bake their conclusions into largely unfalsifiable pseudo-hypotheses in order to give the appearance of making an argument without having to delve into the biology, politics, economics, and history that would actually be necessary to speak cogently on these topics. Also, reactionaries and fascists do this all the time. The overall structure is as follows. 1. Unpacking some fetishes and explaining fetishism. 2. Describing the actual political economy of today. 3. Exposing the hollow, semantic nature of Murray and Herrnstein's arguments. 4. Comparing Murray and Herrnstein's proposed defeatist solutions to historical and contemporary policies and political economic structures that actually improve the standard of living for working class people. And 5. Exploring the relation between fascists and fetishism. Unpacking some fetishes. In the anthropological sense, a fetish is some physical object thought to have occult properties, either inherently, such as the worship of the sun, or through being imbued by a ritual, as in the Eucharist. In a political economic sense, fetishism occurs when the social character of a thing is ascribed to its material qualities. There is an apocryphal story about indigenous people thinking that gold was cursed because of how colonists behaved attempting to obtain it. While gold has certain objective qualities that make it suitable as money, its rarity, its malleability, it was the social relations mediated through money, vis-a-vis markets, that caused the gold mania of Spanish colonizers. For a more concrete example, see the assumption that fast food workers are physically, objectively, not worth $15 an hour, despite the fact that the labor share of output is socially, not materially, determined. There are, after all, countries where the same McDonald's workers would be paid substantially more despite doing literally the same work. They make nearly $45,000 a year in Denmark working full-time. Danish fast food workers aren't just super talented fry cooks. They have a union. The labor share in France, for example, is almost 10 points higher than it is in the US, and whereas the labor share has declined in the US since the 90s, it has not in France. Race. Race is a synthesis of aesthetics, politics, economics, and history. It's not just genetic, and Murray and Herrnstein make no efforts to operationalize the concept. Quote, "We frequently use the word ethnic rather than race, because race is such a difficult concept to employ in the American context. What does it mean to be black in America in racial terms, when the word black, or African American, can be used for people whose ancestry is more European than African? How are we to classify a person whose parents hail from Panama, but whose ancestry is predominantly African? Is he a Latino, a black? The rule we follow here is to classify people according to the way they classify themselves. Historically, race as a concept was constructed for political economic reasons. In medieval times, the French, the Spanish, and the English wouldn't have thought of themselves as European, or even as French or Spanish or English. Colloquially, they would have identified with whatever region they lived in. When the English came into conflict with the French, they would have thought of themselves as Protestant and Catholic. If the Ottoman Empire showed up, they would have thought of it as a struggle between Christians and Muslims. Free and slave, as well as civil and heathen, were historically thought of in religious terms, and such rights were heavily regulated through the church. Religious authorities also often mandated the release of converted slaves, though this was enforced unevenly. The Enlightenment brought about the decline in the power of the church, and then the feudal lords. The merchants, including the slave traders, however, ascended to the status of the new ruling class, and the religious justifications for slavery took on increasingly quote-unquote scientific bases, including racial theories. When the so-called New World was discovered, and the full scope of it came to be appreciated, imperial domination was up for grabs to whomever could snatch up the lion's share. The problem? England had a population of around 7 million people at the time, as compared to tens of millions of Native Americans and tens of millions of other Europeans to compete against. Slavery was common enough in the Middle Ages, but these conditions led, in essence, to a slavery boom. As such, Africans, who had been fair game to all three major powerful religions in medieval times on the basis of their paganism, simply became Negroes, who were enslavable on the basis of their race or savagery, although religious justifications like the Curse of Ham, which had a basis in descent and the occult, remained. Religious reasons also likely played a role in the decline of slavery in Eastern Europe, especially as it Christianized circa the 1500s. What I'm getting at here is that these things are contingent. They are based on resource conflicts and the relations of production. Concepts like race, religion, and nationality are instrumentalized by rulers, slave masters, feudal lords, capitalists, to build up coalitions of the powerful for the purpose of maintaining minority rule. This is hegemony. When this class was powerful in the US, for example, Irish, Italians, Slavs, and Jews weren't white. As the labor movement and the women's rights movement and the civil rights movement grew in power, they formed, along with the socialist bloc, a counter-hegemon. America's hegemon required bolstering, and it needed to distance itself from the Nazi ideology it partially inspired. Thus, the coalition of whiteness was extended. With the capitalist retrenchment following stagflation and the breaking of the Keynesian consensus, capitalists have no need for such a large block of well-to-do white people. Anti-Semitism is creeping back into the West, Polish people are being subjected to hate crimes throughout Europe, and the Democratic Party is reviving the old Russophobia. The buildup of wealth in the hands of white people, in the form of fictitious capital of home ownership, was pursued only because capitalists felt threatened by strong organization among the lower classes. That threat is gone now, so the accords that were struck under those material conditions are also evaporating. The Supreme Court has gutted the Voting Rights Act, legislators are tearing up protester and union freedoms, and the wealth of American white people is declining so harshly that the resulting decline in birth rates is being called a genocidal conspiracy by the very people who ensured this decline would happen in the first place. Let me give you a taste of the sort of treatment race and IQ gets in this book, and then we can unpack it. There are a few ways to try to get past the nature versus nurture conundrum. Admixture studies would be best, but Murray and Herrnstein never really mention them. They instead focus on some transracial adoption studies. An example of this is their treatment of the Minnesota Transracial Adoption Study, which studied children of different racial backgrounds that were adopted by white couples. This study is used by Murray and Herrnstein to reject various positions they previously upheld, that environmental factors matter in general, and that prenatal environment matters in specific. Quote, "But whatever the final consensus about the data may be, the debate over the Minnesota Transracial Adoption Study has shifted from an argument about whether the environment explains all or just some of the black-white difference to an argument about whether it explains more than a trivial part of the difference." End quote. Something which the very study they cite contradicts. It finds a correlation of -0.3 between age of placement and adolescent IQ. It finds a correlation of -0.22 between number of placements and adolescent IQ. Whether a mixed-race child had a white mother or black mother is also worth several points of IQ. The children with two black parents were adopted later and had more placements, and the black-white couples had more education, something Murray and Herrnstein reveal only in the appendices. They then go on to opine, quote, "Poor prenatal nutrition can stunt cognitive potential in ways that cannot be remedied after birth. Prenatal drug and alcohol abuse can stunt cognitive potential." End quote. This is par for the course throughout the text. They take a reasonable or agnostic position, then trivially dismiss it and assert a strongly eugenicist claim, then act like that never happened. Meanwhile, you might get so caught up in wading through the minutiae that you miss the fact that adoption studies still measure race on the basis of a political economic class branded by aesthetics, not measured genetics. Multiple children in the study had to be reclassified because no one could tell that they weren't mixed race. Just in case you think I'm trying to pull a fast one here, note that while the authors of the Minnesota study remain agnostic on their results, there is another similar study that finds no difference. Quote, "An adoption study by Moore, she examined the IQs of black and mixed-race children averaging 8.5 years of age who were adopted by middle-class families who were either black or white. The children who were of half European origin had virtually the same average IQ as the children who were of exclusively black origin." End quote. Further, being adopted by a white couple yielded an IQ advantage of 13 points. Nearly the entire black-white gap discussed in the bell curve. Let's break this down in an observable, measurable, replicable way. First, it is necessary to unpack the idea of race in a way that is actually scientific, not just seemingly so. Quote, "Accumulating evidence since the sequencing of the human genome in 2003 suggests that genetically determined race differences in IQ are a priori unlikely, rather than likely. We now know that there are approximately 3 billion nucleotide base pairs in the haploid human genome, and direct assessment of genetic variation has revealed that the average proportion of these bases that differ between a human being and a chimpanzee is less than 2%, that the difference between a randomly chosen pair of human beings is approximately 0.1%, and that only 10% of that 0.1%, hence 0.01% of human DNA, differs between European, African, and Asian populations, far less than had previously been assumed. Given that the human genome comprises approximately 22,000 genes, this might be taken to imply that only about 22 genes differ between populations, but that would be quite wrong. For one thing, 98% of human DNA consists of non-coding regions, and second, genes within the coding regions typically contain thousands of DNA bases that show slight variations in allele frequencies between populations. The parts of the human genome that differ systemically between racial groups include coding regions containing genes that influence skin color, hair type, and facial features, but race, like beauty, is evidently only skin deep, and the total genetic difference must be much smaller than had previously been assumed. Furthermore, recent research has revealed that racial admixture has blurred whatever genetic differences might have existed previously. Within the United States, white Americans are descended predominantly from European populations, and black Americans from West African slaves. But the latest and best evidence, using high-density genotype data, shows that the proportion of European ancestry in the black American population is as high as 24%. Taken together, these findings on genetic race differences render it unlikely, a priori, that black and white Americans have any genetically based psychological characteristics that distinguish them sharply. A. M. Coleman. All this assuming it's even possible to draw sharp distinctions between African DNA and European DNA. These populations obviously share common ancestors and were always churning with one another. Having said all that, what do admixture studies show? Again, from Coleman. The first study to use this method, Whitty and Jenkins, 1935, focused on 63 children with the highest IQ scores among 8,000 black American children in the Chicago public school system. When the researchers classified these high IQ children according to their ancestry as reported by their parents, they found no evidence that they had any more European ancestry than a comparison group of ordinary black Americans. For example, the results showed that 14.3% of the high IQ children had predominantly white ancestry, compared to 14.8% of the comparison group. This study is old and used parental knowledge of political, economic, racial categorization, but we've come a long way from that. Quote, "Later studies, using more objective methods for estimating racial admixture, and in some cases much larger samples, yielded the same result. Scar, Paxtis, Katz, and Barker, 1977, used 43 blood group markers to estimate European ancestry in a sample of 362 Black American school children in Minnesota and found no significant correlation between European admixture and scores on any of the 5 separate intelligence tests that they administered. Furthermore, the children with the most European ancestry did not differ significantly from those with the least. In fact, there was a marginally significant tendency, p less than 0.1, for the children with the most European ancestry to score lower on one of the tests, paired associates. End quote. Genetic differences don't fall into strongly discrete categories. There's a gradient over all the world. The scientific basis for establishing the political conception of race just isn't there, let alone these sharp intellectual and psychological differences that so-called race realists assert. People have a strong tendency to launder their hunches or preconceived notions through various ideological constructs in order to give them some level of cultural or intellectual veneer of truth. This becomes all too obvious with regards to pseudoscience when political operators fail to employ a test that is valid, which leads to IQ. The right often touts IQ as an objective measure of a person's intelligence, even going so far as to see it as a measure of someone's genetic value. This couldn't be further from the truth. IQ is a psychometric. It comes out of the soft sciences, and is not immediately valid in the way physics or biology is. For example, a breathalyzer test is valid because someone being tested can blow into it and receive a rating. Then, their blood can be drawn and the blood alcohol level can be measured directly. This is how we know the test is measuring what we have constructed it to measure. That's what validity means with regards to scientific studies. There is no such direct analog with IQ. It's not possible to have some children take an IQ test and then crack open their noggins and measure the smartness directly. As such, it is unclear which variables are to be controlled for, rendering all explorations into this topic largely ideological. What does and does not constitute intelligence is also ideological. The whole field is a pretty terrible mess. On the material side of things, it's not brain size or white-gray matter ratio. These differ in men and women, but their mean IQ scores really don't. Different groups sometimes have differing sizes among the same brain region, but using that brain region often can cause it to grow, as in cab drivers. People also use their brains differently, and there is no singular neural path associated with intelligence. Finally, very few genes have been found to be associated with IQ, and they contribute very little. It is likely that the number of genes associated with something as complex as intelligence is very, very large, and the variance associated with any given gene would thus be quite small. Complicating this is the fact that environmental interactions with genes are important. For example, breastfeeding is very important for IQ, but only for people with certain alleles. Some definitions of parental socioeconomic status correlate better with outcomes than IQ. So do some studies of height. If height really does correlate with IQ, and Americans are shrinking, then are we also getting dumber? Height in various countries correlates with income inequality, so it's possible that Reaganomics is physically destroying Americans, and the political economy of the eugenicist is dysgenic. For Murray and Herrnstein's part, their definition of socioeconomic status measures job prestige, income, and education, but not wealth. Most liberals ignore wealth. At the risk of editorializing too much, this is because they have no conception of class. Someone who lives off of $50,000 a year by collecting rent off an inherited apartment complex has nothing in common with someone working 2 jobs to get $50,000 a year. This matters a whole lot when comparing black people to white people in America. It's not just that white Americans are far likelier to have high incomes, they also have more than double the wealth of black Americans within every income bracket. Where are the best schools? Where are the fume-spewing factories? Where are the supermarkets? Where is the water full of lead? Never mind that. How about job performance in IQ? Well, it's kind of a bust. Some studies say IQ is validated entirely by its predictive ability vis-a-vis job performance, Murray and Herrnstein among them. Much of what underpins this finding, however, involves a bunch of dubiously corrected studies. Quote, "Perhaps it is hardly surprising, therefore, that supervisor ratings have rather low correlations with more objective criteria such as work samples or work output." Balmer, Johnson, Rich, Podsakoff, and McKenzie, 1995, Cook, 2009, Henneman, 1986. Schmidt, Hunter, and Outerbridge, 1986, put the correlation at virtually zero. In a study of salespersons, Vinscher, Shipman, Switzer, and Roth, 1998, found that general cognitive ability showed a correlation of 0.4 with supervisor ratings, but only 0.04 with objective sales. However, they exhibited a correlation of 0.3 with subjects' job knowledge. End quote. To be fair, ingratiating yourselves to the bosses instead of doing real work is a useful skill. Murray and Herrnstein argue that, quote, social intelligence isn't real, though. It could simply be measuring cultural adaptability. Quote, the greater the cultural load, the greater the test was associated with IQ. And second, in adults, the researchers found that the higher the heritability of the cognitive test, the more the test depended on culture. The effects were medium to large and statistically significant. End quote. At any rate, parental socioeconomic status and IQ aren't too different in predictive power. The correlation between income and IQ is about 0.15, which isn't awful, but isn't huge either. Quote, these findings were supported by Jenks, 1998, who noted that GATB scores do not predict job performance very well, and that, for reasons nobody understands, the GATB's ability to predict job performance has been falling. End quote. This holds across all levels of job complexity. What I'm getting at here is that Murray and Herrnstein are begging the question. They make no satisfying argument that we ought to consider their definition of parental socioeconomic status to be valid, and so no reason to believe IQ adds anything to the conversation. They're hiding the class structure behind psychometrics and asserting that the psychometrics actually determine class. The relationship between cognitive development and economic outcomes is rather obviously dialectical, and intelligence is built up socially. It takes a village, after all. For Murray and Herrnstein, IQ captures all conceptions of merit, which is a static thing not really varying by culture or environment, and genetics are everything. This is too reductive to take seriously. Education. Parental SES in the bell curve is partially defined by educational attainment, which papers over some rather large differences in the same way that collapsing class to income does. And education is not a degree. A degree is merely a symbol of education. What am I getting at here? Murray and Herrnstein act like American schools are essentially interchangeable, or at least evenly funded. This is a farcical belief and no one really has it. In America, impoverished areas receive substantially less education funding than rich ones. It's not uncommon for children growing up in rich areas to receive 3 to 5 times more per student funding than children growing up in poor areas. This is somewhat unique to the US, where schools are funded primarily on local taxes. Quote, funding differences in the United States generate huge disparities in the quality of school buildings, facilities, curriculum, equipment for instruction, teacher experience and qualifications, class sizes, presence of auxiliary professionals, and other resources. It would surprise most U.S. citizens to learn that disparities such as these are simply not tolerated in other developed countries, where public schools normally receive equal funding in rich and poor communities alike on the basis of the number of students enrolled. End quote. They also take the position, rather explicitly, that interventions in education produce no meaningful impact on IQ, which they then launder to imply, what exactly? That education doesn't impact income or social behavior? These ideas aren't meant to ever meet each other. What remains true is that education does impact income, and parental socioeconomic status has a massive impact on education. And by some metrics, quote, the least gifted children of high-income parents graduate from college at higher rates than the most gifted children of low-income parents. End quote. Not all degrees are created equal, and not all paths to their attainment are either. We can't allow ourselves to forget that someone who got into an Ivy on the basis of their parents and then got straight C's is going to have an easier time getting a job than someone who went to a less prestigious school and got a 4.0. Education often matters more for networking and aesthetic than actual content. Ultimately, it's not just that there is a school, or that the school receives funding. It's everything that is mediated through the school. If the neighborhood is full of leaded water, gang violence, police brutality, and so on, no amount of high-end education funding will lead to a good education. The market. Between 1750 and 1850, approximately 4,000 enclosure acts were passed converting commonable land in the UK into the exclusive private property of large landowners. This resulted in no appreciable increase in life expectancy, largely stagnant rates of literacy, and no increase in wages beyond their 1450 Black Death peak. All of this was funded by the enslavement of several million Africans, the genocide of tens of millions of indigenous people, and a dozen or so colonial projects spanning the entire globe. This land was not merely ceded, it was expropriated through every form of violence imaginable, from wars both foreign and domestic, to heretical purges and campaigns of mass sexual terror. Far from bringing prosperity to all, food actually became more expensive throughout Europe. Working time rose faster than wages fell, however, which did lead to a rise in consumption by some estimates, at least in the UK. During the period 1750 to 1800, the working year increased by several hundred hours, or about 25%, owing to the elimination of several dozen holy days, and even by 1850, people were still working more hours than they did in the 1750s. Quote, output growth would have largely been driven by additional labor input, and the industrious revolution, as Jean de Vries termed it, was responsible for overcoming the adverse effects of rapid population growth. Abstention seemed to have been more important than invention, but it was abstention from leisure, and only partly from consumption, that was the core of economic growth. End quote. That's mostly the British case, since it has some of the best data, but other liberal empires are not dissimilar. Arguably, the entire purpose of the bell curve is to argue market naturalism, the idea that capitalism is purely voluntary and purely meritocratic, that there is no ruling class structure, only free and fair competition, and everyone finds their place in the existing hierarchy on the basis of their genetics. If the market is natural, there is nothing political about capitalism. This is something they largely take for granted. Quote, we will not try to adjudicate these issues or the role that President Reagan's economic policies played, which have taken whole books to argue out. End quote. We've seen already that the real history portrays something totally different from this, a conquest driven by special interests, not a liberation. The list of coups and regime changes the US has engaged in since the end of World War II shows rather cleanly that this conquest is not over. How is this a meritocracy when 60% of wealth is inherited? Capitalists are routinely outinvested by cats. Only about 1 in 20 actively managed funds outperform an index fund, and S&P Global found that there's a stronger likelihood that a top-performing fund will become one of the worst performers in a subsequent period than that it will stay a top performer, and that's without getting into the fees. The only way to outperform the market is to be so wealthy that you can manipulate the market, as in the infamous leveraged buyout. How is this voluntary if popular opinion has no correlation with legislative outcome? The US has just 4% of the world's population, but houses 22% of the world's inmates. We also support 73% of the world's dictators, by our own admission. Murray and Herrnstein are trying to appeal to their readers' perceived class chauvinism. If you're wealthy enough, your experience with commodities is not slaving away in a sweatshop all day for pennies in order to make them, but logging onto your Amazon account and buying them. You're white collar or possibly some kind of manager or small business owner. You meet commodities primarily on the market. You can choose to buy them or not. You can buy whatever you want, and this unrestricted financial license is the true liberal conception of freedom. Commodities are severed from their origin as the product of labor, and what constitutes a market is thought to inhere in the simple interaction of ringing up your purchases, not in the material, historical, and political conditions that underlie those interactions. Bananas are cheap because people just don't value them, not because of repeated coups and regime change wars in Central America. Wages haven't gone up because Americans are just lazy, not because of outsourcing to third world countries where labor organizers are routinely murdered. The social labor process that produced the commodity is hidden behind the superficial market transaction, and the true value of the commodity, the labor put into it, is thought to inhere in the commodity itself and not in any worker. You aren't interacting with another person, your dollar is interacting with a gallon of oil. Marx referred to this as commodity fetishism. This fetishism, in which there is no labor, only trade, reaches its final form in the subjective theory of value, within which it may be possible to create or increase value of an object by transferring ownership of it to an owner who regards the object at a higher value, even without modifying the object. Now, there is no material value. There is only market price, which has no power dynamics behind it, only subjective decision-making. You can't be coerced into this purely abstracted system because to accept a given price is merely to agree, subjectively, that one commodity is equivalent in value to another. Everyone in the market has equal rights, except undocumented immigrants, prisoners, people living in the third world, etc. And if everyone has equal rights, then there are no classes. This would seem to be ridiculous on the basis that people's life outcomes are so heavily determined by the circumstances of their birth, but the bell curve offers us the get-out-of-history-free card of IQ. The caste system isn't political or economic, it's genetic. QED. Which brings us to class. Within the context of liberalism, class is said to be defined by how much money someone makes. To be middle class is to make an average amount of money. Given the income distribution in the first world, it's somewhat incomprehensible what this could mean. In the US, median disposable income is around $35,000 a year. In a more material sense, class is about what you actually do to keep yourself fed, clothed, housed, and healthy. Some people work, some people own, and some people have a mix of both. The latter is the middle class, which in the first world is mostly based on fictitious capital, like 401ks and mortgages, or home equity, as opposed to a factory or a plot of arable land. The right would have us believe that one's position in society inheres in the level of income itself, and not in the real social conditions in which that income is drawn. Again, wealth as the product of labor is obfuscated, and one's relationship to the means of production is hidden. The link between politics and economics is denied. Murray and Herrnstein rely on this confusion to obfuscate the fact that the immigrant and minority families are from lower social layers than the white families they are being compared to. Because of the Electoral College and the nature of districting, white people have political power in the U.S. disproportionate to their numbers, and the political representation of black people is diminished in the same way. White families have multiple times the wealth of minority families, even within the same occupation or income brackets. Murray and Herrnstein cook up a definition of socioeconomic status that helps to ensure their desired conclusions, although this misapprehension of class is common enough among liberals. As for the classes themselves, the capitalist class obviously lives off of rents, dividends, and capital gains, whereas the working class would obviously prefer to abolish these things and keep the wealth they produce. The middle class has a more complicated relationship here, and the small business types are quite different from the retirement account types. Remember what I said about how political economic groupings are contingent, and how the ruling class builds coalitions of the powerful to entrench its own rule? Allowing access to fictitious capital and allowing the buildup of unions, but only liberal unions, not socialist ones, was the compromise the capitalist class offered in the First World in response to the revolutions in the East, the World Wars, and the Great Depression. This was the bedrock of consumerism: higher wages, but not ownership, not real power. Now that the capitalists have won basically the whole board, those unions are gone, and so is your house. Even the aesthetic of this group of New Age vassals, whiteness itself, may be on the outs. In the United States, the Republican strategy is largely based on fear-mongering around this aesthetic, despite being the most responsible for destroying it. The Democratic strategy, on the other hand, is oriented towards adaptation, and a new coalition of the powerful based on education and other intangible wealth, because that's the only kind of wealth that will be on offer in neoliberalism from now on. The Dems seek to build a white-collar class of professionals who have 10 to 15 different careers in their lifetime, and thus no actual profession. They seek to build a coterie of little capitalists who have no access to capital. They want a country of American nationalists who have no meaningful civil rights in a world where capital has gone global. They want total atomization, the social solitary confinement of a worldwide prisoner's dilemma. So that's how all these complex issues are being hidden with superficialities. But what's really going on here? Racial scientism is nonsense. The country is actually being looted by billionaires, not welfare queens. In the next part, we'll discuss the real historical force that has led us to this juncture. Not skull shapes, but neoliberalism.